Good afternoon, if you're on that side of the Greenwich meridian, and good morning if you're on the other side. Welcome to this new Green Talk live event organized by the OECD. My name is Xavier Leflèvre. I lead the water team here in the Environment Directorate. I suppose you are familiar with some of our work on water. Of course, we cooperate with colleagues at the OECD working on water and agriculture or water governance. Here we focus on three sets of issues. One is financing water, and we have set up earlier this year a roundtable on financing water to expedite investment that contribute to water management and sustainable development. Another topic we're working on is water quality, and we focus more precisely on diffuse pollution and most recently on contaminants of emerging concern. But the key topic of the day is our work on water quantity, how to allocate water where it is scarce or where competition to access water intensifies or the opportunity cost of using water increases. This work is spearheaded by my colleague Kathleen Dominique, who is sitting beside me. Kathleen joined the team about 6 years ago, and she has led important work on water in the context of adaptation to climate change and on water allocation. In 2015, we released a flagship report on water allocation. I believe that since then it has been instrumental in identifying good practices for water allocation, proposing a health check that countries can use to assess how robust prevailing water allocation regimes are, and also sharing experience with the management of reform of water allocation regimes, which we know can be very difficult. Today, the focus is on a companion document, which was released very recently. You have a copy here of the cover page so that you can identify it easily. The focus is on groundwater allocation because we understood that groundwater is a burning issue. It raises specific challenges when it comes to allocating that resource, and it certainly deserves tailored policy responses. So that's why we dedicated additional time and effort to better understand the issue and look at relevant policy responses. We think that work is very relevant for people who work on water, obviously, but also on agriculture, urban development, and other issues. It is certainly very relevant for people active in developed countries, and in developing countries as well. So I will invite Kathleen to take us through the main messages that derive from that work. Before I do that, I would like to emphasize that you have the opportunity to ask questions to Kathleen. You can send your questions by clicking on OECD Environment in the WebEx device. We will moderate these questions, and at the end of her talk, Kathleen will have the opportunity to interact with you and answer some of these questions. So I'll stop there and really give the floor to Kathleen. She will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll engage in a more interactive discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Xavier, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this talk. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be. Indeed, Xavier introduced the subject very well because groundwater is gaining more and more attention, and certainly the issue of allocations. Groundwater is the largest reservoir of fresh water on Earth, if you're not counting ice caps. It provides an important source of drinking water supply, irrigation, industrial use, and also supports groundwater-dependent ecosystems. For all these reasons, it's an extremely valuable resource, and so the question of how to allocate it among competing uses and over time is essentially important. So to start, we want to discuss some of the distinctive features of groundwater that merit a special consideration in the design of allocation arrangements. First of all, there's quite a lot of scientific uncertainty about the state of the resource and the use of the resource. This map just gives you an idea of where there is no data, if you look at the gray areas, on abstraction of non-renewable groundwater by country. Compared to surface water, we have a lot less data available about the quality of the resource, the quantity of resource, and also how much users are using. So that poses a significant challenge for designing allocation policies. Groundwater is also typically exhibits the qualities of a common pool resource. This means that excluding users from access can be very difficult and costly. Groundwater can be a very attractive resource because it can be very easy to access for those who can drill their own wells and they access it directly from their land. This chart just gives a demonstration of the sharp rise in irrigation use of groundwater in Gujarat in India over the past 3 decades of the last century. And here you see a very sharp climb that basically corresponds with a rapid increase of well drilling for small-scale users. There are now millions of wells accessing groundwater in India, and this is such a stark trend that it's been dubbed silent revolution. Also, there's another distinctive feature of groundwater is that it accumulates pollution over time. So this picture just gives you an idea of the different sources of pollution, but what's particularly important to take into account for groundwater is that it's very vulnerable to this accumulation because the pollution can accumulate and stay in the resource for really decades. What this means is that it's very important to put an emphasis on the prevention of pollution because it's difficult to remediate the resource once it is polluted. And it also poses a difficulty in terms of legacy pollution sources. Groundwater can be contaminated from chemicals and pollutants that were put there decades ago that may be completely banned from use now. And this makes it very difficult to apply a polluter pays principle when you're trying to remediate the resource because of this legacy contribution. Another important factor in considering allocation for groundwater is that it's really a question of allocating both stocks and flows. When you're dealing with surface water, you're predominantly looking at the allocation of flows and how that can be done among competing uses. But for groundwater, the stock of the resource is very important, and this means that the temporal dimension of allocation, are we using it today or saving it for the future, this trade-off between current and future uses is especially acute. So now to look at some trends, groundwater abstraction has over the second half of the last century basically followed a general trend of surface water abstraction in terms of increases. Here we see that the most pronounced increases in rates of abstraction are occurring in countries where there's already a high level of groundwater use. There's also a correlation between a highly arid climate and groundwater dependence and abstraction intensity, as you would expect. Looking at groundwater use in agriculture, this is a particularly important issue, and this figure comes from a publication that was prepared by our colleagues in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. In fact, we have the lead author, Guillaume Guerre, in the room. It's from a publication entitled Drying Wells, Rising Stakes. It looks at groundwater use in agriculture. And agriculture is a significant user of groundwater. Globally, it's estimated that around 2/3 of groundwater abstractions are for irrigation. And here we see the chart that compares groundwater use from 1990 and then the increase in that use for selected countries in 2010. So you basically see this increase. And on the right-hand panel, you see the direction of the trends, which for most countries who are already significant users of the resource, you see an increasing reliance on that resource. And one point to note here, too, is that we see the 2010 data here. That was the most recent data that was available. And this comes back to the point that data for groundwater use is much more limited than in the case of surface water. Groundwater depletion results in significant impacts and costs in terms of negative externalities and also depletion of natural capital. This is a really nice illustration. This comes from a study that was done using a natural capital approach that looks at the Kansas High Plains aquifer. This is an aquifer that supports significant food production in the US, but is rapidly depleting. Using a natural capital approach, the study estimates that between 1996 and 2005, the profits attributable to the Kansas portion of the aquifer dropped from 2.3 billion US dollars to 1.2 billion. It's a significant decline in natural capital over that time period. So that's a loss of approximately $110 million per year in terms of capital value due to groundwater withdrawal and changes in how the aquifer's management. So just to give you a sense of order of magnitude of what that means, that yearly decline in wealth of natural capital is twice as much, is estimated as twice as much as the state's investment in school infrastructure over the period. So that gives you a order of magnitude in terms of how significant that depletion of natural capital is. Depletion also results in significant externalities. So this again comes from the study Drawing Wells, Rising Stakes. And in that study, there was a survey of 20 regions across 12 different countries. And respondents were asked to indicate the types of externalities that were arising due to groundwater depletion and characterize them as major or minor. What's interesting here is that you see a wide range of externalities, from well yield reduction to increasing costs of pumping, stream depletion, vegetative stress, then ingress of polluted water, salinity, the aquifer compaction, and land subsidence. So this gives you a sense of the diversity of the externalities that can arise from this depletion. Now, the impacts and costs of groundwater depletion help to emphasize the importance of having well-designed allocation regimes. We define this as basically the combination of laws, regulations, policies, and institutional arrangements that determines who can access the resource, for what purpose, when, how much, and how the resource is managed overall. And to do this in a way to try to maximize the benefits that we get from this resource, the total economic value approach provides a conceptual framework to think about the various types of values that groundwater provides. And this basically breaks out the different types of values into use values and non-use values. Non-use values tend to include bequest, altruistic, or existence values, like ensuring that a resource is available for future generations' use. Can also refer to indigenous, cultural, spiritual values. In terms of use values, there's a distinction between actual value and option value. Option value refers to an insurance value or a buffer value that groundwater can provide in terms of making water available in situations of future water shortage. And in terms of actual value, there's a distinction between extractive values and non-extractive values. So extractive values are the ones that are easiest to assess from an economic point of view. Those include drinking water, irrigation, industrial use, mining. Those are the things that we typically think that are easier to understand in terms of how groundwater provides economic value. But of course, non-extractive value, or leaving the resource in situ, also provides base flow for streams and rivers. There can be many complex interactions between the groundwater resource and surface water resource. Groundwater also provides natural discharge for wetlands. So when it's depleted, those wetlands suffer. The avoidance of subsidence. The depletion can cause significant subsidence, which can be very costly and irreversible. And to protect water quality and prevent saline intrusion. As water tables decline, water quality, water pollution can be more concentrated, and also can allow for, especially in case of coastal aquifers, the intrusion of salt water. So the total economic value approach provides us a nice conceptual framework, but of course there's still the question of how can governments design allocation policies in practice. And to start our analysis here, we did a survey of a number of different types of allocation arrangements in 27 different countries, mostly OECD countries, but also included Brazil, Costa Rica, Colombia, Peru, South Africa as well. And here we wanted to get a sense for how the policies were actually working for allocation, and this is what we use also as a basis to develop our policy guidance. So there's a few findings that I'd like to just share, emphasize. One is with regard to the ownership of resources. So this refers to the ownership of the resource itself. And basically, in general, water is almost always considered a public resource. It's managed under the public trust doctrine. That's almost universally the case for surface water. For groundwater, though, there are a certain percentage of allocation systems where groundwater is actually considered private property. That means that there's limitations in terms of the extent you can control pumping in that circumstance. An example here is the use of rule of capture, which is basically when landowners have the right to extract and use the water under their land. And this is still predominant in some parts of the world, including some parts of the US. So it's an important attribute to consider. Then in terms of looking at whether a cap on abstraction is set, the idea of a cap is to set a limit on the total amount of the resource that can be abstracted. Then there's a question of allocating it between different uses. But this cap for the regimes that we surveyed, almost all of them had some type of cap in place, although there's around 8% that do not set an explicit cap. That's basically an open access system. There's many ways that the cap can be set. It can be set in terms of a limit on the actual volume abstracted. It can be a limit on who can abstract, but not a limit on how much. It can also be set in terms of the proportion of the available resource that can be set. And that is actually a very useful tool, because recognizing that the availability of the resource changes over time, having a proportional cap allows that cap to be adjusted over time as well. In terms of defining environmental flows, I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, the value of having those environmental flows. In our survey, nearly a quarter of the allocation arrangements that we surveyed do not have an explicit definition of environmental flows in their allocation policies. Also, many countries use, in times of shortage, a sequence of priority uses where they give some uses higher priority and other uses lower priority. And it's interesting to note that the environment is rarely among the highest priority uses in times of shortage, and typically among the lower priority uses. Basically what that means is that when you do have a shortage situation, that extractive users typically have priority, and what's left for the environment is there. So that puts at risk the environment, the ecosystem services that those flows provide. Then in terms of abstraction charges, in this survey, which covered both surface water and groundwater, I should say, abstraction charges were widely used. They tend to be very low. The most common type of use that abstraction charges apply to are industrial uses. But this is another tool that governments can use to recover the costs of administrating water resources management, and also provide an incentive for more efficient use. Now, in the work that we did on groundwater, we want, of course, designing an allocation system really needs to take into account the context specifics of a given area. Those can be the hydrological conditions, the particular type of aquifer, so the hydrogeological structure, the types of uses, the quantity of use, the rate of depletion. All of those factors are very important. So to dig into those issues, we looked at 9 different case studies that highlight different aspects of where challenges arises and how policies might be able to address them. Our first case study was on Denmark, and Denmark is a very interesting example because Denmark relies on groundwater for nearly 100% of its drinking water provision. It has a very comprehensive allocation regime in place. It has a cap on total abstraction that accounts for environmental flows. They extensively use pricing instruments, including abstraction charges, which also apply to irrigation. They have a very developed monitoring network, especially for quality, and they have a range of measures to try to prevent groundwater pollution, because of course that water is used for drinking water. If it is degraded, that increases the cost of drinking water supply, but it also can deteriorate the resource beyond a point where it could be used for drinking water. We looked at a case in Arizona, in the city of Tucson. Tucson is a city in a desert, and for many decades it was mining groundwater to support the growth of the city. They realized that this was not sustainable, and so they implemented a range of measures to try to address this. They have diversified their portfolio of water resources, whereby they're now using surface water through a storage and recovery program to recharge the aquifer, so then they can use the groundwater. They use demand management and pricing, water banking, so when surface water supplies are more abundant or haven't been completely allocated, they can use any excess to store in the aquifer for times when demand is higher. And this artificial recharge has helped to really slow and completely phase out the groundwater mining that they were experiencing. In Japan, there's another quite interesting case in Kumamoto. This is a PES scheme, so a Payment for Ecosystems service scheme that was developed by private industry in cooperation with irrigators. There's a major semiconductor plant in this area that was using a lot of groundwater and needs very high quality groundwater for its production purposes. And as the water table was depleting, that was increasing its costs. And so they provided payments to farmers to irrigate the land and then promote groundwater recharge. And that has helped to stabilize the level of the water table. The case in Mexico looks at another set of issues. In Mexico, groundwater depletion has caused subsidence, it's caused quality degradation, it's increased pumping costs, and for many years the enforcement of pumping quotas has been really stymied by weak enforcement. So those challenges have been persisting for some time, but they've made some important efforts and positive steps forward in terms of defining environmental flows. And this is a process that culminated in 2012, where they were able to set standards, define standards based on ecological and biological criteria to assure a minimum flow for the environment. And so now the challenge is working on continuing to implement that. The case of Spain also highlights this trade-off between allocating water for extractive uses and also for the environment. In the upper Guadiana Basin, the use of groundwater has really contributed to spurring great advances in socioeconomic development, but of course that resulted in declining water tables, and that had a very visible effect on wetlands in the area, including some very notable sites, Ramsar wetland. And so they put in place a number of different efforts over the years to exert greater control over abstraction, and that's included shifting groundwater from a private property right towards one that's managed under the public domain. That's also included special plans and efforts where the government has provided funds to buy back water rights and then allocate those rights either to environmental uses or towards higher value uses. So they've been able to exert, through these efforts, greater control on abstraction piece by piece. Texas is another example, another case that we looked at, and here the Ogallala aquifer has been depleted for many, many decades. And Texas has used conservation districts to try to slow that depletion through long-term planning. The case that we looked at focuses on the 50-50 scheme in the Panhandle, and that uses, that gathers the irrigators for using that part of the aquifer and has them agree on the desired future conditions. So how much of the groundwater do they want to have left in 50 years, and then sets annual quotas on that basis. And that scheme has been successful in slowing that depletion, although that case also highlights some of the tensions between trying to exert limits on pumping and also private property claims. So some interesting discussion in the case around those issues. In France, the government has introduced a very novel groundwater governance arrangement. It's called the Organisme Unique de Gestion Collective, the OGC. And basically, this is an institution that gives the irrigators themselves the ability to allocate water among themselves. They create the decision rules for how allocation will happen, and this is they basically have an explicit limit or a cap on how much can be allocated, and then it's up to the irrigators to decide among themselves how they do that. The implementation of this scheme is still ongoing. It has run into some difficulties in terms of tensions between different stakeholders, but it's a very interesting example of a decentralized governance approach that allows users to make the decisions around how to allocate water. In India, the case in our report focuses on Gujarat, and a scheme that was introduced there many years ago that basically uses the rationing of electricity supply to reduce groundwater pumping. So energy for groundwater pumping is subsidized in India. That's created an incentive for excessive groundwater pumping. And so what they did is made an investment to separate electricity supply for irrigators and a separate electricity supply for domestic and commercial uses. And that basically allowed them then to ration the electricity supply in predictable time blocks for irrigators. And that has reduced groundwater pumping. It's reduced the cost of subsidies as well for the energy supply for pumping. And that scheme has proven successful, and it's been replicated in at least 7 other Indian states. North China depends to a large extent on groundwater resources for food production and economic development. In China, the case focuses on groundwater trading and how the transition of wells from collective management to privatized wells have given rise to this trading, which is especially beneficial for users who don't have the capital and resources to invest in their own wells. So they're able to, it's a way for them to access a resource by trading with those who do own wells. In China, there's a number of different pilot schemes on trading that are going on at the moment, and the insights and findings from those will be certainly interesting to see in the years to come. So after that quite broad overview of the different types of cases, of course, the question remains, how can governments approach allocation questions for their own circumstances, considering the diverse set of challenges that various countries and various regions face. In our earlier publication in 2015, which Xavier mentioned at the beginning, we developed what we call a health check for water resources. allocation, and it basically distills the policy guidance into 14 key questions for governments. It provides a framework for reviewing current allocation arrangements, finding out where there might be gaps, where things can be improved, and then it makes some suggestions for how those different features and policies can be defined. Then for this most recent work on groundwater, we adapted that policy guidance for the specific distinctive features of groundwater, and a few of them are quite salient here. So I'll just mention a few of them from the checklist, and one is with regard to the legal status of resources. Clearly, in the case of groundwater, where you have the resource defined as private property, that can pose significant issues for allocation, and there are a number of countries and really a trend for governments to shift that private property towards a public resource managed under the public trust doctrine. Of course, that type of process takes a lot of time, and it may be very costly because it can require compensation for buying out those rights so that they're managed in a different way. In terms of understanding the availability and scarcity of the resource, this is a particular challenge, as mentioned, for groundwater because of the lack of data, because of scientific uncertainty. There is more and more well metering that's happening in a number of countries, so this can be a basis of information. There are some new technologies that can give a better idea of the scientific basis for making decisions around allocation, like satellite-based telemetry. And so those are interesting developments, but still there's a significant need for improved scientific basis and research in that area. Setting an abstraction cap, as mentioned at the beginning, it's very important in determining that cap is to consider both the stocks and the flows of groundwater. So in thinking about that cap, you want to think about how the water is allocated for current uses, but also for future uses. So this is really very much a trade-off between current and future opportunities. Abstraction entitlements are very important. So these are basically the water rights or the abstraction licenses or pumping quotas, however they're referred to. But this is defining either at an individual level or at a collective level the amount or the proportion of the resource that can be used. When those entitlements are defined as a share of the available resources, again, this provides more flexibility because as a resource declines or as there's variability, that share can be adjusted depending on availability of the resource. Monitoring enforcement, particularly important to make an allocation regime work, but of course this is difficult due to this widely decentralized use. As I mentioned, well metering is becoming more prominent. It's something that's certainly used in adjudicated basins in the US, it's used in Australia, in New Zealand, in China as well, and other places as well. One option that governments can use when it's either too costly or not practical to meter at an individual well level is to try to meter at a collective level and assign an entitlement as a collective entitlement, and then allow users to then allocate that collective entitlement among themselves. Also to note here, it's much easier, of course, to monitor and meter large-scale industrial users who can be using an order of magnitude larger amount of water than small irrigators. So this is certainly an area where metering and monitoring enforcement is very important. And then the question is, does the allocation regime, the way it's defined, does it allow some flexibility for users to reallocate water among themselves? And this is a very important dimension. This is something that can be done through trading, whether that's formal or informal, but it does not have to be form a water market. It can be done through, for example, different governance arrangements. This is very important because it allows the flexibility for the resource to go towards higher value uses. And it also can have an important equity dimension in cases of water trading. In India, for example, these water trading arrangements can be very important for poorer farmers who don't have the capital to invest in their own infrastructure to be able to access water from others' wells. So those are just some highlights of the aspects of the checklist that are especially important and or difficult for groundwater. And just to finish, I give you a view of what the checklist looks in its entirety. And of course, we go into much more detail about this in the report. And with that, I would like to wrap up and look forward to any of your questions and to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for, I think, a crystal clear presentation. It's great that you have a view of the two reports which really work in combination, the generic one on water allocation and the new one we discussed today on the groundwater allocation. We have about 50 people online, and I'd like to insist that the number of people have been very stable, meaning nobody dropped out during your talk, which I think confirmed that it was really well done. Thank you very much for that. Because we have that large group of people online, I really encourage you to send your questions to Kathleen. As I said, you can use on your WebEx device or screen, you can use, you can push or click on OECD Environment and send your question, and I will convey them to Kathleen. We have our colleagues, some of our colleagues in the room who have done some specific work either on water quality or on groundwater management at large, and I would like to invite them to ask questions if you would like to take the floor to get the discussion started. So Guillaume, in a nutshell, Guillaume leads the OECD work on water and agriculture and has done a lot of work on groundwater and how agriculture policies can respond to some of the challenges.
Yes, thank you very much, Kathleen. A very interesting presentation. I had a question that maybe others may have as well. Is related to the conjunctive use of surface and groundwater. As you presented the abstract, it was mostly focused on the issue of groundwater, but what we see in practice is that in some contexts at least, surface water, when it's not usable because there's not much water or it's bad quality, then the users go back to groundwater, or in some cases, cities prefer groundwater to surface water. So how can you make these things work? The general report that you had on water resource allocation looked at everything, and now we're talking about specific groundwater. So how do you make sure that an allocation regime doesn't make, is not disconnected between surface and groundwater? Have you seen good practices with that? Thank you.
Yeah, so Guillaume, that's an excellent question. Couple of different angles there I think are important to highlight. I only mentioned very briefly at the beginning, but surface water and groundwater in most parts of the world are interconnected in some way. And for that reason itself, those allocation regimes have to be managed conjunctively. So it's true in this talk, I was more focused on groundwater per se, but this is a bottom line message throughout the work. That's extremely important. Why? Because you have the hydrological interconnection, but you also have the other aspect that you referred to, these substitution effects. So two things here. On the hydrological connection, you can have situations where you have groundwater pumping a resource that can actually be also draining a surface water resource. Okay, so if those are managed, those two different types of resources are managed distinctly. For example, if you have very tightly controlled allocation for the surface water and no control over groundwater, which is the case in some places, that unregulated groundwater pumping can basically be using surface water supplies. So there's hydrological flows. The resource is simply interconnected. The second point is also around the substitution effect. So basically, groundwater, can be a very attractive resource because surface water can be have much more variability. You know, as we are seeing climate change happening, we have increased variability in the surface water supplies. So that means that users can switch between preferred uses, and groundwater can be seen as a much more secure source of supply. So we could expect that increasing variability of surface water resources, increasing variability of rainfall as well, is going to put increased pressure on a groundwater resource. So for example, if you have an abstraction charge and a highly regulated quota or entitlement system for your surface water regime, and groundwater is absolutely free except for the energy cost of pumping, and you're not controlling the use, then you can expect to see a shift of water uses, and you undermine basically what you're trying to achieve in the allocation regime. So absolutely, those resources have to be managed conjunctively. There has to be a good scientific understanding of the interconnections, especially when you're talking about environmental flows, and there has to be coherence among the policies.
Thank you very much. I think this looms also to the issue of how much do we know about how much water is available in the aquifer, and that refers to a question which was asked via internet by Arturo. Have you considered the volume of water in the aquifer? And I think the related question is how to deal with uncertainty or lack of knowledge about the exact amount of water in the aquifer. Is it something that you would like to clarify further?
Absolutely. So, so the volume of groundwater in the aquifer, this would be considered when you're considering the overall stock of the resource that's available. Of course, there's quite a lot of uncertainty, as we've said, and a way to deal with that is to be relatively conservative in the way that the resource is allocated. One thing that we do discuss in the report, which I didn't talk about so much in the presentation, was that of course, you see very different allocation arrangements in different countries. Countries who have quite a lot of scarcity, or they're experiencing severe depletion, you're more likely to see some formalized arrangements. Other countries where you may have typically had water abundance or tend to be in wet or humid, more humid climates, they may not have very much in place in terms of allocation policies. What's interesting here is that even if traditionally there has not been issues around allocation, countries are seeing, even countries like the Netherlands, which of course when we think of the Netherlands, we think of flood control, and they have very sophisticated water policies and arrangements there. But much less attention has been paid to allocation of water. However, even in countries like the Netherlands, you're seeing episodes of scarcity. You're seeing also saline intrusion of groundwater supplies due to sea level rise. And these factors mean that scarcity is increasing. So when scarcity increases, the value of having an allocation system, a robust allocation system in place, is extremely important. So how do you do it if you don't really know? Well, we do go through that a little bit more in detail in the checklist. I mean, we're not advocating for all countries to have a highly sophisticated, well-elaborated, fully metered, fully priced allocation system. This can work in certain cases. In other cases, more rudimentary or kind of basic rules of thumb can be used. But basically, one thing we do emphasize is that when there is uncertainty and when you have scarcity emerging, that the policy should basically operate in a fairly more conservative way, because if you get into a situation of over-allocation or severe depletion, this can be very costly and very expensive to try to reform your allocation system to put it on a more sustainable footing, because you typically have to provide compensation to the range of users who are actively using the resource.
Thank you. I think that was quite a comprehensive response. Related to that, Aaron on the web asked a question about enforcement. obviously enforcement and the capacity to monitor who abstracts water, when, under which conditions is a key condition to allocate groundwater properly. We understand it raises specific issues in the case of groundwater. So do you have any good practice to share or principles that could apply to enforcement of groundwater allocation?
Yeah, so of course enforcement is very challenging. You know, a first start here is to make sure that the use is actually metered and monitored, so that's very important. But also make sure that sanctions are in place for cases where people are overusing their quota. We did look at that in our survey to find out if governments were using sanctions and what type of sanctions there were. Sometimes there were monetary fines. Another type of sanction, which seems to have some effect as well, is to basically retract the rights. So if users aren't complying with the amount of water that they should get, then they are basically excluded from using it. Of course, that type of monitoring and enforcement requires funding. It requires money, which is another reason why we also advocate for abstraction charges, not just in the terms of the type of price signal that it could provide to users, but also as a means to at least provide the finance for the effective enforcement of regimes.
I have more questions on the web, so that's really great, and thank you. You can continue throwing or sending your questions again by clicking on OECD Environment. Tom apparently read your slides very thoroughly, and he noted that in the survey, 80% of the regimes in place have a cap, 75% have environmental flows. So is it a case for optimism? This seems to be quite important requisites in place already for sound or robust groundwater allocation. So if that's the case, are we on the right track? Or if not, where are the shortcomings in groundwater management or governance at the moment?
Yeah, well, that is a great question. I like that someone has a case for optimism here. I felt like that was kind of a gloomy presentation. Good observations. Yes, I emphasize that having a cap in place is extremely important, and the majority of the regimes that we surveyed do have a cap. That's what you're observing. Although we do recognize that it's not always clear that that cap is respected in practice. So this comes back to the monitoring and enforcement. And also that's the same case for environmental flows. It's quite positive that we have, roughly 75% of the examples that we looked at do say that they have explicit minimum flows for the environment. But again, it's not always clear that in times of shortage, when there's demand for those resources, if a country is using a priority banning approach, where they're using a sequence of priority uses, that the environmental flows will be protected in those situations. So there can be some ambiguity in the way that the different rules are set up, and so I like the sense of optimism, and this is something that we also say in the report, that many countries have the tools in place to manage allocation, but it's a question of making sure that they're enforced and implemented and respected to really get the benefits of having those types of policies.
Thank you. If I can add my 2 cents, I also realize that environmental flows are sometimes very difficult to define properly. So even if countries consider they are in place, there may be scope for improvements in the way these flows are defined. I have a couple of questions on the instruments, and typically economic instruments, which you have mentioned. One is the economic value approach. In your report and in your presentation, you said this approach is useful but challenging. So do you have an illustration of a country which is using that framework thoroughly, or at least approaching it? And I have a related question on cost-benefit analysis. How can CBA help us as a proxy or as a contribution to this economic value, total economic value approach?
Okay, that's a great question as well. The economic valuation of non-market benefits, and many of those boxes that I was showing there in the total economic value approach relate to non-market benefits, can be complex and technically challenging to do. That's absolutely true. A case where countries have used it, I think the UK is an excellent example of this. The UK Environment Agency has used the total economic value approach in their groundwater policy making. It's been useful for them to help promote the implementation of the water framework, the EU Water Framework Directive. It helps them assess where measures might impose disproportionate costs. Can also be useful to assess, do a cost-benefit analysis of regulations for the remediation of contaminated land or water. Can also be used for cost-benefit analysis for measures to prevent groundwater pollution. So it's true, it takes time, it takes technical expertise, but if you can quantify and put some economic valuation on the non-market benefits of groundwater, can be very useful in these types of situations. Another thing, promising development in the UK is that they've done a lot of work on natural capital accounting for various types of ecosystems, and they're also exploring how they can apply the natural capital approach to groundwater, which should produce some very interesting results. So that's one example. I would say the UK is quite advanced in this area and this type of thinking and taking a more economic approach in these types of policy questions.
Thank you, and I think here we have a strong case for further international cooperation, sharing about good practices and learning about what works well in different countries, and that's typically what we like to do here at the OECD. I have a couple of questions on the availability or the robustness of data, but before I turn to this, I would like to give a chance to my colleague Hannah Leckie, who coordinates our work here on water quality, to also ask a question. Hannah?
Thanks, Xavier. Kathleen, a great presentation. One quick question. Would you have any advice to governments that are looking at improving water efficiency and, for instance, reducing leakage or having drip irrigation and potential trade-offs with reduced groundwater recharge?
Well, that is a very interesting question, very pertinent question as well, which actually we didn't really touch on in the presentation. One of the aspects of a robust allocation regime is not just considering the entitlement to abstract water and figuring out whether that's a share or a specific quota, but also trying to take into account the return flows of that water use. This is where improvements in efficiency can come into play. So basically, efficiency improvements can actually reduce groundwater recharge, which is very important. So if the allocation of the water for that irrigation is being used more efficiently, less is flowing back into the aquifer, it can actually have negative effects on the overall state of the water resource, because you're losing this type of return flow back into the environment. So this is why there's a lot of discussion around the cost effectiveness and the utility of continuing to invest in efficiency improvements. There can be, of course, a rebound effect from that, and also this issue of reduced recharge is a very important one. So this gets into very much the finer details of allocation, but it is frankly very easily forgotten, and so it's a very important point to be included. It's actually a point that we include in the checklist. I didn't go into it there, but this accounting for return flows Sounds like it would be difficult to do, but there are some rule of thumb approaches that we do discuss in our reports that can be used to try to estimate with coefficients the return flows for different types of uses.
Thank you. I think this is also clearly a case where there is room for empirical analysis and to look into more details on a case-by-case basis about the benefits of water use efficiency. And the point here is to avoid blanket and standardized responses. A couple of questions on the web on data and the availability of data. Apparently, this is a theme that comes back regularly when it comes to groundwater allocation. So one of our correspondents on the web questions the reliability of the data or knowledge we have about the volume of water available in the aquifer. So I think you alluded to that already in the presentation, but could you clarify how reliable this data is, or are there new techniques or options, methods to improve the reliability of the knowledge we have of the aquifer? And related to that, I think a very pertinent question on climate change and how it affects groundwater availability. In your introductory remarks, you suggested that groundwater is more or less shielded from the impact of climate change. Is it always the case? And so could you elaborate a little bit more on how climate change affects groundwater availability? Does it create additional uncertainty about groundwater availability now and in the future? And how do you to manage that uncertainty?
Okay, thanks for those questions. Regarding the data, how reliable are the data? I won't be able to give you maybe a fine answer on that. I think it's very difficult to say, frankly. In general, the data is fairly patchy. Some of the data as well can be quite outdated. So in terms of, if you look at some of the most, what I would consider credible sources of water availability, you will see estimates. The most recent estimates might be more than a decade old or even older. So this raises questions around how reliable it is to be used today. So I think this is a perpetual issue. I did mention that there were some newer technologies. There's been some advances in satellite-based measurements. This is something that NASA's done through their GRACE project. It's quite interesting. It uses satellites to measure changes in groundwater based on shifts in the gravitational pull of the Earth, which actually, puts the whole topic into perspective when you can measure something in that way. That said, those measurements still need to be validated and verified with ground level measurements, so they only provide part of the picture. To come to the point around climate change, there's a few different things we can expect, I think, in terms of impacts from climate change. One is with regard to direct impacts on the resource itself, so basically through changes in recharge. And there's a lot of uncertainty around this, and it depends a lot on the hydrogeological conditions of different aquifers. You see some projections whereby increased and more intense precipitation events could increase groundwater recharge, and other projections where in more arid places, rainfall is predicted to be more sparse and fewer and far between, and this could put a decline in terms of recharge on groundwater. So we can expect that there are going to be some effects, but they can move in both directions, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Another impact from climate change that you can expect in terms of groundwater is with regard to sea level rise. So where you have coastal aquifers, there you have increasing pressures and increasing possibilities to have saline intrusion. This can be have a really important deterioration effect on the quality of the groundwater and can make it unusable for some purposes. So that's certainly a very real risk. And then I would say also in terms of impacts from climate change, as I mentioned in the presentation, what we can expect is to have more variability in terms of surface water supplies, more variability in terms of rainfall, and longer and more severe droughts. Okay, so given that, you can come back to this question of which resource might users want to use. If surface water becomes less attractive and less reliable, that definitely points to increasing pressures on groundwater.
Thank you. We are coming to, close to the end of the session. We can still extend the time for a couple of minutes if you bear with us. Actually, I would like to maybe conclude by combining a couple of questions which were raised, but which are also close to my heart on the reform of groundwater allocation. So in the events that groundwater has been mismanaged in a particular country or region, we understand it can be difficult or challenging to reform the prevailing arrangements. So how, is there any good experience that can be shared about these reforms? And one additional challenge that comes to mind is sometimes groundwater use is actually driven by energy subsidies, so by policies which are initiated independently from or in other spheres of government. You mentioned, I think, the case of Gujarat in your presentation. I remember from earlier work the case of Tarifa Nueve in Mexico. So any progress made in the reform of groundwater allocation regimes, and can you share any lesson on or encouragement from successful reforms?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question to end on. Reform is a very important topic, especially because when we did this survey of allocation, a very significant percentage of the countries that we surveyed were either currently reforming or had recently reformed their allocation arrangements. So we certainly saw this question of the political economy, the how to make reform happen, as a very important question because of course, as I've mentioned earlier, you have users who are accessing the resource, maybe a private property, or they may have acquired that right over many, many years, and it's very difficult to try to reduce the amount of water that users can take and to deal with these competing uses. So that can make allocation reforms very contentious. It can make it very costly. We wanted to dig into these issues, so we actually looked at 10 or 11 case studies of different examples of reform in different countries. So we looked at the UK, for example. I think we have a case from Canada, one from the US, a range of different countries, South Africa as well. All of these different areas were facing different issues. It might be with regard to promoting reform in order to improve the economic efficiency of the resource. It may have been promoting reform for more equitable use. That was certainly a prominent theme in South Africa. Many reforms are motivated also by securing more water for the environment. So that can be very difficult to reduce the overall take of users. Certainly, I think there's really a lot of rich material in that discussion, which is in our 2015 report. But I would say we can be optimistic. I mean, one of the lessons that came out of that is that reform is a very long and iterative process. It's not something that happens overnight. One of the advice that we give is that authorities, governments, don't try to approach that from too much of a technocratic or technical point of view of just trying to optimize resource and where it could be, but they have to do that in the context of, or they're more likely to be successful if they do that in the context of a policy dialogue that systematically engages with the stakeholders So you bring the various users around the table who all have interests in the way the resource is used, and find and negotiate acceptable solutions. And that may be, asking users to reduce their take, but providing them with more security in terms of the entitlement they have, maybe giving it for a longer duration. That may be providing compensation to those who are reducing their take or who are being bought out of use as well. So it's a question of balancing. These types of reforms often come down to having some winners and some losers. And when those reform processes are handled well, there's ways of compensating those who either are in reality or perceived to be losers of those reforms. It takes time. It takes serious engagement. It takes a strong scientific evidence base, although not all actors around the table might find the science convincing. So it takes time to socialize those messages. But I would say, I think we can be optimistic in terms of where you have a well-defined process, where the interests are all considered, and where you have compensation measures or accompanying measures to help soften the potential costs of a reform on various users or particular groups. That can be very beneficial.
Thank you, Kathleen. Sorry, I can confirm these are very challenging reform processes, and I'm happy to say that a couple of years ago we actually facilitated such a process in Brazil, and you can have more information about that process if you visit our website. We could go on, the conversation could go on, because obviously groundwater and the allocation of groundwater is a topical issue. So I would like to thank, I still think we need to come to a close. I would like to thank the very active group which was on the internet for a very active contribution. We had to select some of the questions because of the constraint of time. The conversation can go on if you visit our website. You will be able to see the reports that Kathleen was presenting today. You will see our contact details at the back of the report or on the website as well. If you visit our website, you will also see more information about our regular work on water, particularly the report on Brazil, which I just mentioned. But you will see also updated information about the future Green Talks Lives. These have been very successful ways to actually engage with a wider group of people whom we don't regularly meet in our conferences or workshops. So I'd like to thank my colleague Beth, who made this happen. Please, this is not the end of the conversation. Go to our website, engage with us either via mail or by posting messages, and we'd be happy to share more and respond when we can. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day wherever you are, and we look forward to engaging with you in our next Green Talk Live events.